Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. And before we introduce Lee and get stuck in, I think I'm just going to put in the chat here a quotation from Ayn Rand that I think sets this off really well. If men identified introspectively their inner states 1/10 as correctly as they identify objective reality, we'd be a race of ideal giants. And I'm really hoping that we might get some insight into that tonight, why that's such a powerful quotation. And Lee, I know you're going to be
yes, George.
You're going to be leading us this evening. But one thing that I think we have to make clear is the Ayn Rand Center meetup groups have a wide range of participants. And I know we've got professors of philosophy here, and we've also got people who may have just be halfway through the Fountainhead. So I think that context is important. And I think if we could start off and then you take it from there, like explaining what introspection is, because, you know, in my private practice and in all my work that I do in the rehab that I work in, etc., the closest anyone comes to knowing what introspection is a little bit of mindfulness. That's about as close as the sort of general culture understands that. Maybe
and that's not very close.
No, but looking inside, they see it as if I look inside, and sometimes through meditation, I'm able to tell why I'm angry. That's about the closest introspection most of my clients have before they start any work with me. So I think it would be great if you could explain what introspection is, and we've got some other experts on introspection in the audience as well. And then I'm really grateful for you doing this and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, particularly as you preface this as not introspection on emotion, but introspection thinking on thinking. Over to you, Lee. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, you know, I'm gonna resist a little bit your plea here, because what I really want to do is I want to set a little context. So I actually want to start a little bit, talk a little bit before talking about introspection, about just a bit about thinking and knowledge and volition. And then I want to throw in a quick word about what I call creatical thinking. And then we go into introspection. So I wanted to set a little context first, if that's agreeable to you. But I will say this, introspection, which according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you want to accept that as some authority, it's a means of learning about one's currently ongoing or perhaps very recently past mental states or processes. That's a rather vague and generalized idea. Anyway, introspection was the original principal methodology of scientific psychology back in the old days, as practiced by William James and Wilhelm Wundt and Titchener, and my favorite old psychologist, the Würzburgers, who came from Würzburg. But with the ascendancy of behaviorism in the early 20th century, and then later on of methodologically behaviorist so-called cognitive psychology, later in the 20th century, introspection nearly disappeared from the psychological scene. And there have been many attacks on the validity of introspection over the years, both from psychologists and philosophers. But I think the most that they show, or can show, is that introspection can be misleading under certain circumstances, especially contrived ones. But that's really true of any kind of thought process. So what I want to do is describe introspection on thinking. And by that, I will give you something to chew here. I mean, conceptually identified what is going on in your mind while you are thinking. In other words, I view introspection as a form of thinking more than as a form of perception, but I'll come back to that later. And it's not only a method of scientific psychology, either past or present, but it's also an important personal practice whose goal, when I'm talking about introspection on thinking now, whose goal is to provide guidance for keeping one's thinking on track to its goal. Now, I'm going to throw in a few little cognitive tasks here and there in the discussion today, but there's no pressure because I'm not asking anybody to give an answer, to provide an answer. All you have to do is think of the answer to these things. Because the proof in what I'm saying, the proof is in your pudding. You can tell me what you did in the chat if you like, but you don't have to. So let me give you a little simple one. Some people are disqualified, like Rosie, who's heard this. Well, you can still think the answer, I guess, because you're not going to tell the answer. So, but here's a simple task. And this is a simple, I guess you could say, spelling task, but it's really easy because what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to, I'll spell the word and you just have to say what it is. All right, so you don't have to, you don't even have to spell it, you just have to say it. So it's a very easy spelling task. Okay, here goes. What does C-O-A-S-T spell? C-O-A-S-T. And what do you put in a toaster? Now, I would imagine many of you, I don't know how many we've got here, quite a few, I think. Your brain, for some of you anyway, your brain popped a piece of toast into your mind. And so you might have come up with the answer toast. But I find that when I try to toast a piece of toast, which is never, when I try to do that, it comes out burned because it's already cooked. So of course, you don't put toast in a toaster, you put bread in a toaster. But it's quite natural to come up with the toast answer. That's for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, brains like rhymes. And so they just pop things out based on rhyming, you know, not necessarily, but that's not necessarily what you want. It's often not what you want. And that's what I call the brain over mind answer. Now, what I would like to do now is one other quick task, give you one other quick task, see if you can do the mind over brain answer, or as it were, the introspectively guided answer. This time, slow down a little bit, because one of the essential points of introspection is slowing down the process. So just slow down the process and try to make sure this time that the answer to the question that you give is the answer to the question asked. Just spend a little more time on that, and let's see what happens. Okay, here goes. What does S-I-L-K spell? S-I-L-K. And what do cows drink? Now, the brain over mind answer, of course, is milk, but this time you didn't say that. I would imagine you did not say that. I'm sure you guys have all seen cows. They're huge. And I've tried to visualize a cow milking itself. It just doesn't work. Cows drink water. So between those things, if you got toast the first time and you got water the second, that's the difference between introspectively guided thought process and one that isn't. I mean, in a very primitive way, because really all it involves is slowing down a little bit, being a little bit more aware of going on in your mind. Okay, so let's talk about thinking and knowledge, and I will be brief to provide a little needed context to make a few observations. Thinking as a goal-directed process, not just musing or ruminating, is the cognitive process that produces new conceptual knowledge from old. It is a goal-directed process of asking yourself questions and then answering them. And goals come from your values, so it is a value-driven process. The questions that you ask can be explicit or implicit. For example, merely holding a word in mind, if you just keep a word in your mind, that engenders the implicit question, what is it? What do I know about that word? Roughly speaking, in thinking, we consciously ask ourselves a question, then subconsciously answer the question. And that's how you produce new knowledge. Now, I say roughly speaking here because the content of the question, or at least the possible content of a question, is actually supplied subconsciously. So the division between conscious and subconscious is not as absolute as I make it out. Now, knowledge is both the product and the fuel of thinking. That is, knowledge provides the conceptual connections needed to propel thinking from one step to the next. But it also is the goal. What you're trying to achieve is knowledge. So it's sort of like maybe what a breeder reactor does. A sustained thought process requires a continuing infusion of relevant knowledge to keep it moving towards its goal. So here's the simplest possible example. The old-fashioned syllogism: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, and therefore you immediately come up with Socrates is mortal. And so what happened there is that you started with one piece of knowledge. By adding in a new piece of knowledge, you get further knowledge. By the way, this also works with women too. Xantippe is a woman. All women are mortal. Xantippe is a woman. Therefore, Xantippe is mortal also works. Just to be politically correct here. Anyway, your brain automatically supplies your mind with some of the knowledge necessary or required to sustain thinking to its goal. But here's a key point. We know more than we use. We have more knowledge than we use in thinking. Just as we know more than we use in speech. There's a big difference between active and passive vocabulary. Automatic neural processes, your brain, do not always automatically bring to mind the knowledge needed to keep your thought process moving on track to its goal. So you can get stuck. You can get overloaded. Your mind can get wandering. You can fall prey to bias. Well, okay, this is where volition comes in. Activating the further knowledge that is needed to keep your thinking on track to its goal requires the volitional direction of your attention to what is important for resolving whatever key issue that is stopping you. And so to think about something means to bring into the focus of awareness something into the focus from the fringe. That's a distinction. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that. It's not that often mentioned in objectivism, but in our awareness, we have a focus, the main stuff you're thinking about, as opposed to things on the fringe, which are more fleeting and more vague. This is, I think, apparent in vision, most apparent in vision, where you have the fovea, where the image is very sharp, and then the periphery, where things are somewhat vaguer and less clear. Anyway, the longer you maintain focal attention to a thought object, the longer you do that, the more knowledge relevant to that object will be activated. And philosophers and psychologists from across the spectrum, from the arch pragmatist William James to the arch realist, the objectivist Ayn Rand, and even some others, have identified the attentive effort of directing thinking as the locus of volition. As William James says, effort of attention is the essential phenomenon of will. That's in William James' Principles of Psychology, 1890, by the way. James also says, to think is the only moral act. That's also in Principles of Psychology. I believe William James is, he may be one of the worst philosophers ever, but he is absolutely the best psychologist ever, or the greatest psychologist. Ayn Rand writes, and I quote, "Free will is your mind's freedom to think or not, the only will you have, your only freedom, the choice that controls all the choices you make and determines your life and character." That's from Galt's speech, or you can get it in For the New Intellectual by Ayn Rand. So here's a little more extended quote from a different book by William James. This is from William James' Talks to Teachers, which is about 10 years later than Principles of Psychology. And he gives I think, an even better description of the nature of free will as a chapter on will. And I strongly recommend it. You can get it on the internet. William James Talks to Teachers is the book. And I'll just give you a short excerpt from there. James says, "If then you are asked, in what does a moral act consist? When reduced to its simplest and most elementary form, you can make only one reply. You can say that it consists in the effort of attention by which we hold fast to an idea which but for that effort of attention would be driven out of the mind by the other psychological tendencies that are there. To think, in short, is the secret of will, just as it is the secret of memory. So that's James talks to teachers, probably about 1900. So the mental effort, which is volition, results in holding something, particularly a conscious question or intention, explicit or implicit, in mind in a thought process longer than it would otherwise have remained there. Volitional action is always overriding the automatic, what comes to mind automatically, by retaining content in the focus of awareness that would have disappeared, or by bringing in new content from the fringe of awareness. And this action results in more knowledge about that thought content coming to mind and becoming active in the thought process. And here I must appeal to your own self-observation to verify this description of volition. I think that we all know from our own experience that within certain limits, we can choose what we attend to and how long we attend to it. And the basic purpose of volition is to keep your thinking moving on track to its goal, while overriding any bad programming, bad assumptions that may stop or sidetrack thinking, or cause it to slip by some key issue too quickly. Now, how does volition keep thinking moving towards its goal? Volition pumps knowledge. The longer you exert mental effort to hold something in mind, the more knowledge comes to mind, is activated. As we've seen before, that's what keeps thinking moving, is the infusion of fresh knowledge. That knowledge fuels your continued thought process. So let's try a bit of a knowledge activation example and see how that works. This one is one of my favorite little questions. It went out of, let's say, went out of style for a while, but it's come back now, I think. I think it's come back. And let's see if it's come back. There are these objects. They're discs made of vinyl. They have a little hole in them. You put them on something called a turntable. Then you put something else that's called a needle on the thing, and it goes around and around, and sound comes out. Often music comes out. These things are called, in the old days, I don't know what they call them now. They still call them LPs. They used to call them LPs for long playing. And anyway, the particular kind I'm talking about, a record, is 33 1/3 revolutions per minute and 12 inches in diameter. Those are the measurements of the usual LP. 33, they go around 33 1/3 revolutions per minute and then 12 inches in diameter. And the question for you to think about is simply, how many grooves are there? Grooves on a 33 1/3 RPM 12-inch record. And I'll let you think about this for a moment, not for too long. Now, if you're furiously calculating, I'll give you a hint. If you're furiously calculating, you're on the wrong track. Because that information, like a lot of information in the world, that information is actually irrelevant. Joe says about 50. David's got, he's reached the first plateau. His answer is wrong, but it's good. It's a good wrong answer. And Stephanie has also reached the first plateau. It's got a good answer, but it's wrong. So what do you do with the question like this? Well, what do you do with any question if you don't know what you're doing? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Activate some relevant knowledge. And I'll just go right to the key issue here. What is a groove? You think about what a groove is. And if you were to say, draw a groove on a piece of paper, you can try this. You will find that it's not as you might have assumed. See, bad assumptions come in very easily, even non-verbally here. You might have assumed that a groove is a collection of concentric circles, but it isn't. If it were concentric circles and you put the needle down, it'd go on one circle and never go anywhere, just go around and around. Instead, a groove is I'm sure some people are getting it, a spiral. It spirals in from the outside into the middle. And once you activate that piece of knowledge, aha, you get one. And the 33 1/3 and 12 inches is irrelevant. However, there's another question you might ask. Sometimes your first insight is not going to be your last one. Another question you might ask is, what is a record? So let's say you're playing a record and you like what you hear. It's an old, it's an old LP, so it's a Beatles record or something, and you like what you hear and you want to hear some more, but you don't want to hear the exact same stuff again. What do you do with the record? And I'm sure, yeah, Josh just did it. Yeah, flip it over, and therefore the correct answer is 2. Okay, that's just to give you an idea of what knowledge activation is. And also a useful point here is that knowledge activation is typically verbal, I think, but not always verbal. I mean, it depends on the subject matter. Uh-oh, Monty Python. Yeah, there was some kind of record, at least one, where there were 2 different tracks on the same side. And you put it down one place, you got 1 track. That's kind of an exception. Or another exception would be, there used to be these recording booths. I don't know if they still have them. When you go in and you record a record yourself and a plastic record comes out in the slot, they only had 1 side. So there are exceptions, but, generally speaking. Okay, so whatever programming we may be subject to, whether it be from genes or parents or schooling or socioeconomic status or other environmental factors, those things can be overridden by volitional effort. With volitionally centered attention, you can activate more knowledge than comes to mind automatically and get to correct conclusions which would otherwise not be reachable, as well as you can correct errors that would otherwise be uncorrectable by overriding the programming. We can choose to make our judgment based on all available facts. That is to say, objectively, though not infallibly, but objectively, including both relevant examples and counterexamples in our thinking. Because counterexamples are not very likely to come to mind automatically. Your mind doesn't want to do that. You want to support what you already think is true, but that's why volition is so important. And this also means we're open to the kind of self-correction that is not available to deterministic systems, such as computers. There's an epistemological argument against determinism in objectivism, and also it's all over the place in other sources as well. Here's my brief version of the contradiction of determinism argument. The argument: a deterministic program, like an artificial intelligence program, can modify itself in accordance with that program, but it cannot override itself. It can modify itself in accordance with the program, but can't override itself, and is therefore severely limited in its ability to self-correct errors. So the modern philosophers and psychologists, such as Daniel Kahneman is a famous one, who assert that human thinking is in general and by nature biased, not objective. They're right. Those people are right, if the factor of volitional override is not taken into account. If you don't take that into account, which they don't, because for the most part, most modern philosophers and psychologists are one kind of determinist or another. Okay, so that's all well and good, but however, just trying harder is not enough to sustain effective thought process in all situations. As the great 20th century philosopher Curly Howard once said, "I'm trying to think, but nothing happens." You have to be focusing your attention on the right issue. You have to activate the right knowledge. If you can activate the right knowledge, you can achieve any cognitive goal. Now, how are we able to make sure that we focus our attention on the right issues? How do we do that? And here's where what I call creatical thinking comes in. That's creatical, Creatical, creatical thinking. Yes, this is a word that I thought I invented. When I went to the internet, I found, much to my displeasure, that there's this guy back in 1980 who wrote a book called Thinking Creatively. However, number one, this fellow was a Korzybskian semanticist. And I don't want to get into that, but I can tell you the main tenet of Korzybskian semantics seems to be that things are not what they are. You know, A is not A. So it's not a very good view, to say the least. And I think the guy's dead anyway. I think the fellow who wrote this is no longer with us. So I'm going to take over this term and use it in a more productive way, I hope. Creatical thinking is bringing to the volitional process of bringing to mind the right knowledge for getting your thinking back on track to its goal. When what comes to mind automatically or just by trying harder has left it stuck or confused or wandering or sidetracked. Why creatical? Because it's a combination of creative and critical. Creative and critical. The idea there is that there is a common underlying process to both creative and critical thinking, which is overriding the faulty mental programming, the faulty assumptions that make bad critical thinking, that make for bad critical thinking, and break good creative thinking. Good creative thinking. Let me say that again. That makes for bad critical thinking and breaks good creative thinking. That's what bad assumptions do. Those two things. So you have a thought process of overriding that is common to both kinds of thinking. And there are three essential stages of creatical thinking. One is introspection, which is in this context means identifying the key issue that is holding your thinking back, that is impeding your thinking. And the second step is recollection or knowledge activation, bringing to mind knowledge beyond what comes to mind automatically about the key issue that's stopping you. And then there's imagination, using the knowledge brought to mind to resolve the key issue that's stopping you. Now, I'm just going to go on now. I'm going to focus on arguably the most important step, which is introspection. Identifying the key issue in your thinking at a particular time, that is, or another way of putting it is identifying what to think about next to get your thinking back on track when what comes to mind automatically has caused it to become stuck or sidetracked, in error, biased. Okay, now I do not envision introspection as a form of vision. I mentioned this before. Introspection is not some mysterious observation of an inner world of consciousness by using a mythical third eye. There are no sense receptors for introspection. Rather, introspection, as I use the term, especially here, is the conceptual identification of what is going on in your mind. That is, of the various mental entities in your mind and their transformations during thinking. All awareness is, and I'm using the words here of the late objectivist philosopher Alan Godhelf, all awareness is me being conscious of something. Me being conscious of something. Or as James Gibson puts it, the continuous act of perceiving involves the co-perceiving of the self. When you perceive, you're also perceiving yourself simultaneously as the perceiver. Gibson noticed that whenever you're looking at things, your nose is in the picture. You know, what you're seeing, and your nose is is information for your ego, for yourself. And he, by the way, Gibson himself had quite a fine nose. So anyway, the awareness goes together. Now, the normal default condition in awareness is the something, the entity in the world that you're perceiving or existent as the figure, and you're perceiving it as the ground. The foreground is the thing you're perceiving. That's the default condition. We basically are oriented towards the world. But you can reverse that. In my view, introspection is an abstraction, a conceptual abstraction from the totality of experience. It's the abstraction of the I am aware part from the I am aware of something, that whole, that WHOLE. Generally, you end up in a verbal description of the abstraction from experience of mental entities. But abstraction is not, this is a epistemological point. Abstraction is not denial or even ignoring of the objects of perception and conception, of the things out in the world. When you abstract out the mental entities that you're focusing on in introspection, that does not mean that you are totally blanking out the world. The world is still there, but it's a little more in the background than in the foreground, let's say. One way of looking at it comes from the Gestalt psychologist David Katz, who distinguished what he called poles of experience, which he called them subjective and objective. That's a terminology, well, his terminology. But if you take your arm and move your finger along your arm, or you can use a pencil or something and do it with the pencil. There are two poles of experience you can attend to. You can attend to the objective pole, which is the fact of that it's a pen moving along your arm, but you can also attend to the feel on your skin, the sensationistic feel on your skin, and you can attend to either of those things. Or another way of putting it is you can attend to the object or the form of awareness. And introspection can be seen as the abstraction out of the form of awareness from the total picture that contains both form and object. Okay, well, that was maybe a little too theoretical, but anyway, I wanted to get that out. What are the objects of introspection? Well, they're not brain processes, and they're not knowledge of the world. That's extrospection, but they're the forms of consciousness, such as words, images, emotions, pleasures and pains, things of that sort. And those things, at least many of them, serve as mental handles for volition to grab onto, to pump knowledge, needed knowledge, into the thought process. Okay, so how do volition and introspection work? How do they work together? So first thing to do when you're going to perform an introspection on a thought process, mentally step back from what you are doing. Normally it means, or at least often it means, you should stop doing it. Introspection is often, at least, if not generally, is immediate retrospection. It's a form of very rapid immediate memory, because it's very hard in most cases to solve a problem and introspect the problem simultaneously. Now, I must say, you can learn how to do this. You can develop the skill. I noticed this myself with a physical skill, shooting baskets, that, it's kind of hard to shoot baskets, shoot it, and when you're shooting basketball, to shoot the ball into the basket, for those of you who are not basketball players, it's kind of hard to shoot it and be thinking about how you're doing it or what you should be doing at the same time. It's somewhat difficult. But if you practice doing that quite a lot, you get better at doing both things simultaneously. In other words, introspection is also a skill like any other skill. And you can develop the skill, and the more you develop the skill, the less you have to do immediate retrospection, and the more you can do it online. All right, there's another reason for stepping back, besides this skill and demand on your limited awareness reason. You also want to distance yourself, if you can, somewhat, as best you can, from the assumptions you make while thinking about something, because you're going to want to either identify them or at least identify where they're causing trouble. And sometimes the mere act of stepping back is enough to reveal to you what the key issue is, what it is that's stopping you. And then you just ask, what's the key issue? Your introspective question is, what's the key issue here? What is stopping me? What is slipping by too quickly in my thinking? What is stopping me from making progress? What would I like to know more about to get my thinking back on track? Those are the kinds of questions that you would have in your mind when you're doing introspection on thinking. So this is what you do when you're stuck, confused, when you've made a mistake, when you're wandering. That is, when it's what to do when you don't know what to do, when you've lost the thread, so to speak. And then what you normally want to do in this process, and I will give an example here soon, Um, a good thing to identify introspectively is the difference when you're stuck, is the difference between where you are now and where you want to be in your thinking. Where you are and where you want to be. Identify those differences as clearly as possible, because that's where the key issues lie, or the key issue if there's one. And then once you identify the key issue, you could activate your knowledge about it, and then get your thought process moving again. If you can activate the right knowledge, you can achieve any cognitive goal, at least any achievable cognitive goal. So activating the knowledge about the key issue and activating the key issue, figuring out what it is an important step of any thought process. And what I mean by key issue, by the way, I should say in passing at least, is the key issue is something in your thinking that is important, matters to your thought process, and is unresolved. Two things. Okay. I've already said that. I think I can. Let's take a look at a little to concretize some more here. Let's take a look at, this is a very famous problem. It's in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But that's not the first place I saw it. I saw it years before that in other sources. And it's an interesting little problem for our purposes. This is the bat and ball problem. And the problem goes, a baseball bat costs $1 more than the ball. Together they cost $1.10. How much does the ball cost? Now the brain over mind, or sucker answer, as I sometimes put it in another context, would be 10 cents. And but that's wrong, of course. That's wrong. You could do an algebra thing if you wanted to. You could do x plus 1 equals, let me see, x plus 1 equals $1.10, 1.10, and solve that. But if you just play around with the numbers a little bit, just play around with the numbers, try some slightly different numbers, you will quickly see that the right answer is 5 cents. Now, Kahneman thinks that there are these two systems, the fast intuitive system and the slow analytic system, that two different cognitive systems, entirely different. I don't believe that. I'm not sure of this, and I don't think we know for sure in this area, but I think there's one system, and what it boils down to is your thought process managed consciously, volitionally, or not managed? That's the real difference. Kahneman doesn't have that distinction because he doesn't believe in free will. So he has it as just two systems. There has been some interesting research on this problem that shows that people that come up with the 10-cent answer, the brain over mind quick answer, are more likely to be religious, more likely to believe in religion than those who don't. And the interpretation is that the people who get the right answer are more analytic and think things through better, and the religious people are more apt to engage in what some would call intuitive or one-shot thinking. And I think that's true. But by the way, they didn't do this, but I suspect that the same result would hold for socialism. I think that if you believe in socialism, you'd be more likely to get the wrong answer here as well, because that's also a sucker answer situation. Professor D has given us the correct equation, yep, for the problem, but you don't need algebra. You don't need algebra to actually get it. Anyway, I think both ends of the political spectrum are likely to get the wrong answer, both because neither end is good at sustained independent thinking. They can't do it. They don't know how to volitionally get it. Betsy Spicer got 10 to begin with, but she probably had an inkling, which I'm going to get to in a moment, and then revised her answer, and I guess got it right. Got it right then. Okay. Let's see. Now, some of you here may be wondering what connection, if any, exists between this, what I'm talking about here about volitional effort and managing it, and the objectivist concept of focus. This is a very tricky issue, and I'm just going to touch upon it. We can discuss it more if anybody wants to later, but anyway, to explore this issue, listen for a moment to perhaps the most important lines written by Ayn Rand that she never herself published. These are taken from the journals of Ayn Rand book. This was unpublished material. And Ayn Rand says, values set the psychoepistemological rhythm or tempo of cognition. They make one hold a given percept or concept in mind long enough to integrate. Integration is what makes a thing or issue real. Thus, non-attention or non-retention is a matter of lack of values, and values have to be connected to action. Okay, here comes the part that I think is really important. And quote, out of focus state may be a state of rushing past everything, psychoepistemologically, parenthesis, close parenthesis. An out of focus state may be a state of rushing past everything, while focus requires slowness. And then she puts a question mark in parenthesis after this, as something that she wants to think about further. I hope we can erase this question mark. And then she says, think this over. It has many implications. So this is an undated, this is from some clipped notes that were undated. They're in the Journals of Ayn Rand, page 679 for those who want to look it up. So focus is slowness in the tempo of cognition, quote unquote, in the sense of holding important content in mind longer than it would have remained there automatically, thus activating more valuable knowledge about it. So what Ayn Rand calls slowness can be seen as a description of the Jamesian volitional holding in mind of thought content, keeping it there longer. The right amount of slowness, as determined introspectively, ensures that the knowledge needed to keep thinking moving toward its goal will be activated. Okay, well, there's certainly more to be said about that, but time marches on. Let me move on, and I want to talk about the question of when should you introspect? You can't go around introspecting all the time, or you end up like that Greek philosopher who fell in the well. You know, you can't do that. So it's an important question. Sometimes you just know because you're stuck, or your answer is obviously wrong. You know that you have to refocus, as I put it, introspect. Other times, though, you rely on what I refer to as inklings. And this is an idea that I first introduced to an objectivist audience long ago, way back in Staten Island, so long ago that it's before some of you were born. Anyway, inklings, as I use the idea, are feelings about thoughts, signals from your brain to your mind about the progress of thinking. And they're feelings that run from aha, in other words, keep going the way you are, or you've reached your goal, from aha to uh-oh. And uh-oh is, please refocus me, I'm in trouble. Your brain, it's a signal from your brain to your mind, telling asking for some volitional help. The brain can't do it. Brain doesn't have, by itself, does not have volition. This uh-oh signal, or what I sometimes call the stinkling, often occurs with misapplied automatisms. For example, here's a quick example. A long time ago, I was talking with a friend of mine. We were driving along, talking with a friend of mine about blundering and stupidity, and the psychology of blundering and stupidity. And this is, before you had electronic keys and stuff. We drove into one of these parking lots where they ask you to leave the keys in the car. So I did. I got on my side. He got on his side. We closed the doors. And what happened? Yes, we locked the keys in the car. And somehow we were able to get in through the trunk somehow. A lot of people like popper. Anyway, I was able to open the trunk somehow and burrow through the back seat, and we did eventually, but it was a lot of trouble. But what happened here? What happened was At that time, as I had been for a long time, I was living in New York City. And in New York City, you have an automatized habit. It's perfectly reasonable. It doesn't really do any good, but it's perfectly reasonable. You lock your doors of your car when you get out of your car. You lock them. It's just a habit. But you don't normally have your keys in the car when you do that. That's the point. So this is a misapplied automatism. And inklings often signal a misapplied automatism at work or about to be at work. So when I got out of the car, I remember this, as I got out of the car, there was a faint voice in the back of my mind, a faint voice saying, something's different here, you know, not necessarily exactly in those words, but some kind of message. There's something different here. But I didn't pay any attention to the faint voice. Big mistake. I got out of the car, and I remember as I was closing the door, it dawned on me what was going on. It dawned on me, but I couldn't. It was too late. I couldn't grab the door, and the door got away from me, and the door closed. But that's what an inkling does for you. It tells you that there's something wrong with the automatic processes going on. You need to do something volitional. It's sort of like a rock in your shoe. And here I want to give, see, time is moving along. I want to give my favorite example, my all-time favorite example. And this is one I used way back at this Stone Age objectivist conference. And there may be a person or two here that remembers, a few people that remember this one, but I'm going to do it because I really like it. And it's just a simple question. In Great Britain, since many of you are there, I guess. In Great Britain, is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? Is that legal? Think about that for a moment. Is a man allowed legally to marry his widow's sister? Okay, I'll let you ponder this for a moment. You don't have to have any special legal knowledge to answer this question, by the way, not necessary. Well, here, I'll give you my own, yeah, you got it, Betsy. I'll give you how this worked in my own thought process. I read about this in a psychological research study from 1908, a study of insight or something. I read this, and my first reaction, which was mercifully brief, was, why not? But just about simultaneously, or maybe right after that, why not, I had an inkling, a rock in my shoe, a feeling that something is wrong here. Something is not quite hanging together. And I know what that is. That's a signal from my brain and my mind telling me, you got to identify the key issue, you know, introspection, do some introspection, identify it, and do something. So you kind of run through the elements, the conceptual elements of the problem. You want to identify, by the way, you want to identify key issues as narrowly as you can, as is reasonable. So I'm just going to go to it. The key issue here is widow. So the question in your mind is, what is a widow? And when you have a key issue, two things to do that are almost always useful, if you can do them, is look at definitions and examples. If you can get a good definition, go for the definition. And if not, well, and then either afterwards, or if not, you go for examples. Definitions are supposed to, yeah, his widow. Definitions are supposed to give you the essentials, define the essentials, the most important thing. So you go with that. Toppers, they're having a lot of fun there in the chat, I must say. Anyway, so yeah, decode. But decode means, what does it mean? What knowledge do I have about it? So you start with definition, and a definition of a widow is a woman whose husband is deceased. So if a man has a widow, go back to the problem. If a man has a widow, he's dead, and then it becomes a matter of what do you think about dead people's rights? Should dead people be able to marry or not? And I think generally speaking, the answer is no. So that's my favorite example. It's silly in a way, but it's a good example. So my recommendation here is monitor your thinking for inklings. You can call that a form of introspection, but I would call it introspection light. It's just be on the lookout for something. And then monitor your thinking for inklings, and then pay attention to and follow up on them. If you get an inkling, follow up on them. That's a very important thing to do if you want your thinking to be focused. All right, maybe I'll just say a quick word. I don't know how we're doing. What's my situation here, Rozzy? Am I should I be wrapping up here? What's going on?
No, you
Rozzy?
can keep going as long as you want.
I can go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to say a little bit about the implications for education, and then also maybe a little bit when we can discuss it. Maybe people will be able to help me with this in discussion. I want to talk about what the implications are for promoting objectivism of the skill of introspection. Anyway, I think this the skill of how to think about what to think about next, identifying the key issue in your thinking, is maybe the key missing element in all education at all levels. It's something that is not explicitly taught, as far as I know, in any schools from grade school to grad school, as I like to say. And I think it should be. I think it's certainly, I think, the most important thinking skill that's not taught in school, but it could arguably be the most important thinking skill to teach in any case. So where could you start doing this? Well, we know from research, there's some very, very old research that I've always remembered, performed by these nuns, that found that 8-year-olds know just about as much about memory and how memory works as cognitive psychologists do. They just don't have the same language. They know that rehearsing helps. They know that you remember things that are first or last better than things in the middle. They know that categorizing helps. They know a lot of the stuff that, if not most of the stuff, psychologists know. So certainly by the age of 8, kids are building up a lot of introspective knowledge just on their own. So I think even at that age, or probably earlier, you could start teaching it. But it's something that people can learn at any age. And in my view, introspection is the key skill to learn to best operate volition, to use free will, for the use of free will. You don't really teach people how to use free will. You just do it. Everybody knows how to exert mental effort. That's not really the issue. The issue is, when do you exert mental effort, and on what content, and for how long? The direction of mental effort is the real issue, and that's where introspection comes in. And in my opinion, anyway, having had a lot of students of various ages, many, if not most of today's students, have not really learned how to sit. What I mean by sit is sustained independent thinking. They might learn it in a particular domain. So if you're a computer engineer, they may learn how to sustain a process of coding over many, many, many steps. But when it comes into some process that's not in that domain, they're not so good. They can't go too many steps. And that's a big problem. If you want to convince somebody, say, of the importance of having a free society with individual rights, there's a considerable thought process involved with a lot of steps that they have to be able to work through, and they have to be able to work through and understand it themselves. Henry Hazlitt made note of this in Economics in One Lesson in his book. He pointed out that the arguments for intervention are easy. Put me in charge, and I'll give you goodies. I'll give you some good stuff, and that's it. It's not much to it for the most part. But the arguments for the free market are more subtle, and they involve a number of steps, and they involve a wider context than people work at. That's what the whole book, Economics in One Lesson, is about. The fact that it takes a longer thought process and a wider thought process to grasp the value of free society, and you can't do that if you don't use your volition properly, and you can't use your volition properly if you can't introspect properly. So let me put it that way. So in politics, what I call the sucker answer, the answer that pops into your mind automatically without any effort, that's wrong, that he should be allowed to marry his widow's sister. You know, the sucker answer is in politics is socialism. The sucker answer in epistemology or metaphysics is religion. You know, things that are easy, but you're not going to get past that stuff unless you're dealing with people that know how to run their minds, to manage their thinking better. And also, if you learn how to use your volition, you then understand yourself as a free agent, not just as an argument from the outside. If somebody tells you human beings are free, they need to be free to survive, okay, that's all. But if you understand it from the inside out, you understand how that works because you are a free agent and you know how to do it, you're going to be much more receptive to that kind of argument, I believe. So that's why I think free will is the crucial point. If you want to argue politics, argue free will and introspection. And I think it's important to do that. And what's more, if you don't argue for free will, you can't win, I don't think. I don't think you can win. I mean, you could say the same about reason too, I suppose. But anyway, I'm talking about free will here. So maybe I better stop at this point and just say in a summary. Wait a minute. I did want to give my, to illustrate an introspective technique. I did want to give my problem with the 6 classes. And this is where I was going to use the share screen function, but we'll just go back to the old-fashioned way, which is I will just get a piece of paper, and I'm going to take a moment here. And of course, I'm an absolutely horrendously bad artist. There is no one worse than I am. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to do something here. And this is the question. I'm already messing up. Yeah, I'm going to do it again. This is the question of the 6 classes. You have 6 classes in a row. I'm going to number them. No, I'm just going to go. I'm going to go with the paper. Okay, so I don't know if this is visible or. There are my 6 classes. It looks like it's backwards on this. Anyway, you see there are 3 full and 3 empty. Everyone see that? The first 3 are filled with, let's say, your favorite liquid. In my case, it would be cherry vanilla Coke Zero. But you can put in whatever you Brits drink at the pub, or whatever you want in there. And the last 3 glasses are empty. And the task is, you are allowed to touch and move only one glass. And by touching and moving one glass, you are to go from 3 full and 3 empty to full, empty, full, empty, full, empty. Okay, to an alternating pattern. Is the task full, empty, full, empty, full, empty? That's the task. By touching and moving. By the way, you can't pick up one glass and use it to push another around with. I'm going to disallow that. Can't do that. Can't push, take one glass and push another. So that's the task. Is that Rosie, can you see that? Can you see the okay. So that's the task. Think about it for a moment. I'm going to put something else down here while you're doing that. Okay. So, I mean, maybe for some of you, you'll get the answer right away. Others will look at it and say it's impossible, perhaps. And you may wonder, some of you may wonder, well, how do you solve a problem like this? Well, what you do if you can't solve something, my general advice is step back, identify what the key issue is, and activate some knowledge about the key issue. That's a sort of general piece of advice. And so introspect to find what the key issue is, what it is that's stopping you, where's the gap in your thinking that's causing trouble. And in this case, as often the case, it helps to specify the goal. That's a very generally useful principle when you're trying to do anything, is specify your goal very clearly and see how it differs from where you are. I mentioned this before. What's the specific difference between where you are and where you want to be? So in this case, see if I do that for you. Let's see, the bottom part is the goal, and when you step back and introspect on this situation a little bit, you want to identify what's new and different in the goal. What's specifically new and different? That's where the key issues. That's where a key issue is going to be, if there is one. And notice in this situation that these are the same. There's a difference. Same, different, and same, different, same. I'll go through that again. Same here, different, same, different, same. So the difference really boils down to two positions. One that I labeled 2, this is the one I labeled 2, and the one that I labeled 5. That's the whole, everything else amounts to being the same. So now you can reformulate the problem. Now that you've done that, you can reformulate the problem as glass number 2 is now full, and we want it to be empty, and glass number 5 is empty, and we want it to be full. And that reformulation often gives people the answer, right? Just that by itself will frequently. None of these things work all the time, because everybody's a little different how they're wired up. But this will help most of the time. And if that doesn't help, we can go further. You can always activate more knowledge. You can always do more knowledge activation. If you're still stuck, you might go to the question. You might think, well, isn't the nature of a glass important here? Might not be important. So ask yourself, what is a glass? Not particularly what is it made of, because you can think about that and think, well, what if the glass was made of wood? What if it's made of stone? What if it's made of glass? What if it's made of metal? Doesn't really matter. That's a very useful technique, varying things to see if they matter, but I can't get into that more deeply right now. Anyway, that's not what matters. What matters here is the function. What is a glass functionally? What do you do with a glass? And if you think about that for a while, you realize, well, what do I do with the glass? I pour liquids into it, and then I drink them or pour some liquid. As soon as you start pouring things in and out of it and realize that's the function, it's very likely you'll get to the solution, which of course is to take glass number 2, pour it into glass number 5, and return number 2 to its original position, and you have solved the problem while satisfying all the conditions. Okay. All right, I think this might be a good point to at least get, I could say a few more things, but I think let's stop now and see what anybody has to say. How are we doing? Are we going to Josh now? Is that our next step?
Yeah, we'll go to Josh in a second. First of all, thanks, Lee. That was great,
Yeah.
and I think the how active the chat is proves that that's the consensus here. Before
they're having a fun time there. I could tell.
Yeah.
I didn't read all of it, but they seem to be having a fun time.
I didn't read all of it either, but Josh has been keeping track, and he has collected some questions. We will go to we will prioritize live questions, as I mentioned. So if you do have a question which you want to ask live, if you raise your hand now, you are guaranteed to be able to ask it because we only have 2 hands raised. But we will go to, also Josh had some technical difficulties, but he's here now. So let's go to Josh.
Okay, thanks, Lee. That was fantastic. And yeah, I'm sorry that I had some technical issues quite near the end.
That's
so
all right.
I'm sorry if I missed a couple of bits and bobs.
I'm glad to see that you're still here, though.
We got some questions in the chat, but Razi, did you want to do live questions first?
Yeah. Let's do a couple live questions, and then you can go to some chat questions. So Joseph is first.
Yeah, excellent talk. How much work would you suggest putting into introspection versus goal achievement? And what kind of payoff should I expect from introspection versus working on goal achievement?
Now that's a very Joe-like question somehow. It's a good question. I don't know. It's like other things in education. I think the best time to do it, the best time would be young, when you're not going to be doing a lot of other stuff, when you're developing your skills. It should be a skill that you develop. It's better to develop it earlier than late. But I do think it's worth thinking about for anybody at any age. How much time to spend on it? Let's say if you're out of college. I mean, if you're in college, you ought to focus on it. You ought to learn how to introspect, because it'll help you get through college. At least some things. Now, once you get out, it's still helpful, but I can't give you a quantitative answer once you get out of college. It may have something to do with what your other alternatives are. If you're in a situation where you can immediately make millions of pounds, and delaying would notice I said pounds, not euros. You can make millions of pounds, and delaying would perhaps make that much less likely. Then you better not spend your time on introspection. But if you can find some time when you're not in the middle of some big deal, then it becomes it's not a pressing matter. It's not something you have to do. You must do right now, but it's an important matter. It's an important matter that's not a pressing matter. I guess that's the best I can do on the fly there. But the best way to do it is to learn when you're young.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question is from Betsy. You're unmuted.
Okay.
There she is. Hi, Betsy.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. The way you were speaking today sounds like how to get information you already have and use it. But that's
not
basically,
necessarily, but yeah.
That's basically deductive. In a lot of ways, I'm thinking of my own process, introspecting about it, and about like the problems that you gave. And my approach is very inductive. I consult what I already know, and then try to find, or if I don't already know, I go out and I look at the things I'm trying to understand, to see what's relevant about them, what's important about them, to this particular case. It's not, it's often very inductive, where I'm looking at particulars, like the record problem. I pictured an actual record, and I was looking at the grooves, in the record, not consulting concepts I had, but looking at it, and I was thinking, how many grooves? Well, some records have lots of grooves and some have fewer, depending on how much material is in there. So it's a function of how much time the record plays. And I said, well, what is it? And I said, well, it goes around 33 times every minute. If it plays 10 minutes, then the record has, 33 times 10 grooves, and I checked it, and then I checked, yeah, that makes sense. So, but that's the way I was actually picturing an actual concrete record.
Yeah, well, first of all, though, okay, I probably should have put in there in this question of what do I know, the question you ask yourself of what do I know about X? It's really what do I know or can know. It has both.
Okay.
Because I don't think this is specific to either induction or deduction. I don't use induction or deduction. I use both. And in fact, most thought processes require both kinds of thinking. So I don't quite break it down that way. But yeah, it holds for inductive, and it's probably easier to see if you think of the question. The basic question is, what do I know or can know about X?
Okay.
Now, as
Okay.
regarding the record, though, I'm wondering, when you thought about, did you spend any time thinking about, because I know you like definitions.
Yeah.
Did you spend any time thinking about what the definition of a groove is? That's the more deductive part. So I mentioned that there are two questions that that are very commonly useful when you're trying to activate knowledge. One of them is there a definition? What's the definition of this term? And the other is examples. And the definition is, if you will, more the deductive part. The examples are more the inductive part. But as I say, I do both things back and forth. But did you think about the definitional part of a groove? It doesn't sound like you were thinking about that much. Because a groove, if you think about it, it's a continuous curve.
Yeah.
At no part does that curve break off. And for that reason, the whole business of the 12 inches and the 33 1/3 turned out to be totally irrelevant.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay, this is interesting.
Okay.
This is good. If you got a piece of paper in front of you and draw what a groove looks like, it's a spiral.
Right. But it comes around to the place where it was, and it does that 33 times a minute. So
wait, it comes down to the place where it does, but it spirals into the middle.
Right. Well, actually from the middle out. But okay.
Well, it doesn't matter either way, right? But
it spirals, yeah.
It spirals into the middle, and it's a continuous curve. In other words, it's one entity.
But
one thing.
It goes around and comes around to the adjacent curve at the same point 33 times a minute.
No, it doesn't do that, because
33 and a third times.
It's an adjacent point, yes. And then it goes further and further in. But the point is, the groove itself is one continuous curve.
Of course.
And therefore, it's one thing.
Oh, so, okay, you're saying, you're looking at it that way.
It's actually one thing.
Okay.
And that's the key to the problem. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the actual
I was
key
thinking in terms of, the one,
well,
two,
see, here's one thing this might be of some interest. This might be of some interest. Most of us don't use records. I don't use records anymore, right? Because I don't believe all that stuff about analogs better than whatever it is. I don't know. Anyway, we don't even use CDs anymore, but CDs have grooves that are continuous concentric circles. So if you're thinking in terms of what a CD would be, you can't answer. You won't get the answer one. You won't get the one or two answer. You won't. So maybe you're thinking in terms of what CDs, because that's the way they in fact work, if I remember correctly. All right, that's interesting. Thanks, Betsy.
So Josh, we have some questions from the chat.
We've got we have some chats in the questions from the chat. Eamon asks, Lee, what's the difference between modifying and overriding?
Well, now I am not a computer professional. I'm a weak programmer. Haven't done much programming. I've done none in recent times. So maybe I shouldn't even be talking about this stuff. But I do know something about some of the modern deep learning programs, because I was interested in particularly the chess one. Because I used to play chess. I don't play any chess much anymore, except occasionally online, very rarely. And in chess, the programs have gotten extremely good. The best program in the world, which I guess is the AlphaZero program, is about 1,000 points better in the rating system than the world champion of chess, Magnus Carlsen. And Magnus is about 1,000 points better than I am. And I am about 1,000 points better than a ranked beginner. So, slightly above ranked beginner. So there's a lot of variation, and the programs have gotten really good. There was a time when I could beat every chess program in the world, but that was way back when. And now I can't touch my cell phone. I can't beat my cell phone. So, okay, what's the point here? The program can modify itself and learn to play chess better, but there are still some things the learning that it does is totally conditioned by what it's already done, by the program that exists when it's learning. So it can modify itself in accordance with what its program allows to be modified. Human beings are not like that, because free will is not part of an algorithm. It's going beyond the algorithm. It goes beyond. We have some what counts as programming, automatized activities, programming. But when you exert free will, you're basically going outside the bounds of the program, and no computer program can do that, I don't think. Now, this is possibly an arguable point. I think this is the essence of the argument of the contradiction of determinism. I really think this goes to the heart of it, that a deterministic system can't entirely correct itself. It can maybe make some corrections, but it can only make corrections in accordance with what the program allows it to correct, and nothing else. Whereas we don't have that limitation. Our self-correction is open-ended. We can in principle self-correct anything. Maybe in practice it's too hard sometimes, but we can self-correct. But the computer programs can't do it. So that even the strongest chess programs occasionally do really weird things once in a while, or can't solve certain kinds of positions. And it doesn't matter how much learning you put into it, they still get stuck. So I don't know if that's, I guess, if the question answer wants to say a little bit more, I could maybe go further with that question, but that's what I have to say at the moment. It's an important point, because it's the reason that free will gives us that free will makes knowledge possible. Computers don't have any knowledge. Computers have zero knowledge. When I say the computer plays chess, that's a convenience, a verbal convenience. The computer can totally whip me at chess, just beat me to death, but it doesn't understand anything about chess or anything else. It has no understanding whatsoever of anything. Maybe this is clear. This will be clear. I have a better example. Back when I was a graduate student at Cornell, a professor from Carnegie Mellon came, and she had this wonderful computer program that solved physics problems. First year problems from first year physics. And she was, very happy to demonstrate this and say that we're now going some ways to learning how people understand physics. And I said the question I asked was, couldn't someone sit down, a person who knows nothing at all about physics, sit down, hand simulate the program, solve all the problems, solve every single problem without understanding anything about physics, so that therefore this tells us nothing about knowledge or understanding? And her answer basically was, well, this is just the first step. That was her answer. And I don't think it's even a first step. Artificial intelligence is a misnomer. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence. There's artificial brute force that can do a lot of interesting stuff. It can crunch big data and more and more interesting stuff. But it doesn't know anything. It doesn't understand it. It has no knowledge. It cannot validate. In particular, it cannot validate knowledge. So maybe that's helpful. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks, Lee. We've got Dr. Binswanger has his hand up. I'm wondering, Harry, if you want to share something.
Lee and I argue about a lot of things, but I want to say that he and I are probably the only two people in the world who have our fingers on the essence of this problem, and we basically agree. This problem being, what is human consciousness like, and what is our volitional control over it, and isn't that of paramount importance in people's lives and in changing the culture? So to register that since 1988, when, well, of course, I knew Lee back at Columbia a bit in 1966, 7, and 68.
No, not that early.
68.
That not quite. Yeah.
68. You were there for the riots, right? Okay.
Some of them.
But in 1988 at Staten Island, I heard his lecture on these topics, and I was blown away because I didn't know anyone else in the world was thinking about them and coming to the same conclusions that I was coming to. So I want to thank Lee for giving this and encourage him to go on. And I'm not going to argue about anything. I'm going to ask you a sincere question.
Okay.
Which is pursuant to that issue of overriding. Do you think, have you given any thought to the idea that we cannot delete anything from the brain or the subconscious? We can only wire around it. I kind of lean towards that, and I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I have thought about that a little bit. I think can you actually delete something? I don't think you can delete it just like, you know, here, it's gone. You know, I banish you. You're gone. Just in the same sense, I don't think you can give standing orders in the sense of, here's this one order and you're going to do this forever. What you do is you give orders over and over and they become standing orders. And maybe you can delete something over and over. I'm not sure, possibly, but it's not just like a computer, how you can delete memory in a computer. Clearly it isn't that. And normally I think you do, as you say, work around it. Very often you don't even really challenge the assumption. You just activate knowledge against it, and that's the end of it. So at least I've thought about this. One question I thought about this in connection with, I was going to use, but it's another one of these British American things. And I don't know, I'm going to give it anyway. How many outs are there in an inning of American baseball? And it's another one of these sucker answer questions. People often give the answer 3. But an inning of baseball, which is not the same thing as innings, cricket's got innings, not inning. They don't have an inning, I think. But anyway, it doesn't matter. In baseball, an inning actually consists of an at-bat for each team. So if you activate that knowledge that it's an at-bat for each team, it doesn't really matter whether you erase the assumption, the bad assumption that leads to the quick answer 3. I don't think it matters whether you erase that assumption or not. If you activate the correct knowledge, you get the right answer. And you probably can't erase the bad assumption in the sense that you can erase a piece of computer memory. So I guess I'm saying you're right.
So suppose you have a premise that you have to sacrifice to help your fellow man, and you want to disintegrate that, is the term that's used, to disintegrate it. Is there, I mean, I don't know the answer, but can you negate the connections of that to other things, or do you just establish a new connection to the proper way to act?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that myself.
I'm not sure either, but I do tend to, just from the kind of the experience I have with some simpler problems, I think it is not an essential to always even identify what the bad assumption is and then try to get rid of it. You just activate the right knowledge, and eventually it overthrows the bad knowledge. I think that's how it works. But these are one of the many things in the field that we are working in that's not, we don't know for sure. There's a lot of stuff like that. We need more people. Even, I mean, the two of us can't do it all, or can we? Can we do it all?
Sure, we can do it all.
Gene can do some too. Okay, all right. So never mind. Nobody else should go into this field. Unless
they need a
you
license.
want to do something really interesting and important.
They need a license.
It should be licensed.
Yes.
That's right. From us. we have to give the license too, right?
Who else?
No, the government does. It's the government. Yeah, it's the government. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
So Lee,
Yeah.
I've got a question here from Professor D.
Good old
And
Professor Jose.
And it says here, when I was a child, I was told a racist joke about how poorly behaved Mexicans are compared to Cubans or Spaniards. I probably laughed because I was probably following cues from everyone else. I repeatedly hear and say the joke throughout my childhood and teenage years. Later, I become an objectivist. When I hear that same joke today, I can feel like my subconscious gives me an urge to laugh. But upon lightning quick introspection, my emotions turn to disdain. Is that the correct process of introspection? Can it override what the subconscious brings up, but never change it?
I was with him all the way until he got to the never change part, because I think it will. I think it will change it. It may take. In other words, this is the same issue we were just talking about with Harry, I guess. That when you have assumptions, bad assumptions, do you absolutely have to? This is, I guess you'd come up with this in psychotherapy too, but I don't do that. That's your bailiwick. You know, do you have to confront the bad assumptions, or can you just trample them over with the right stuff? And I do tend to think you can trample them over with the right stuff, but it's not like going to happen in one instant. And it can be useful sometimes to identify the bad assumptions and attack them directly. I think it can be useful, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And I would guess that Jose doesn't have that emotion nearly as strongly now than he used to. If he had it strongly then, I'll bet he doesn't have it as strongly now. That's what that's my guess. Or you could ask him.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is,
hasn't that feeling been greatly attenuated? Isn't that feeling much less now, Jose? Professor D, that is.
I'm not sure if Professor D is here anymore. But you know, one thing that I will say is that particularly in addiction treatments, which you're dealing with huge amounts of automatization, etc. You use a combination of directly attacking and just complete changes of behavior, where you just keep challenging the automatized behavior, and you keep going round and round until it shifts. And there's a lot of the whole
that seems quite reasonable.
And they often say it takes 90 days to change things.
90 days, okay.
90
but there
days.
May be some circumstances where, Bob thinks you have to confront the error as such. I don't know. I find from the things I think about are mostly in problem solving rather than in these emotional situations. And I don't always have to I do not have to identify the assumption in order to override it, always. But it's not a bad thing to do. I don't think, there's nothing wrong with it. It might be quite helpful. I'm just questioning whether it's an absolute necessity, I guess. But sometimes it's just simpler to just trample right over it. I mean, it's maybe very difficult. There could be cases where it's hard to identify exactly what the wrong idea is. And identifying the wrong idea, as I said before, doesn't instantaneously get rid of it anyway. It's a process. If just thinking of something, of the truth, immediately removed all of your automatized false assumptions, well, that would eliminate psychotherapy, I guess. You'd be out of a job, sir. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. It's not quite that simple.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on from that, just I believe that Stephanie has her hand up. Stephanie, do you still want to ask a question?
Yes. But now I've got lots to say, but I'll just ask my question. After I say one thing in response to what you and Harry were talking about, based on the little test you gave us with the milk and silk and all that stuff, and I've heard them before. And the first time I heard them, I was all on board with milk. And then it was like, oh my God, I was all pointed out. This time, the word popped in my head, but I corrected it. So it was like, I don't know, years apart. But what it's telling me is that there's a simple thing. But with these really complex ideas, we're trying to get people to move away from valuing altruism and valuing self-sacrifice, that's just not going to happen like that, right? They're going to retain it. Even if on one level they go, yeah, you make a lot of sense, but all this stuff is all automatized subconsciously. It's no wonder they change. They can't change the way we would like to see them change, right? So what is overriding? I would like you to give the example. That was my question written. Was it sounds like it could be dangerous, that you're just kind of trampling over yourself. And I've been learning in the thinking lab that you can't do that. You have to pay attention to what's there and give it a hearing, and you can't just go override and not come back later and examine it when you have the time. So can you give example what you mean?
This is an empirical question. I think you can. I think you can just do that. But what we don't know for sure, I can't prove it to you. But I just find in my own thinking, I don't always have to go back to if I can activate the right knowledge and get that working, that will work for me, regardless of what I did in the past. What I did in the past, the effect of the past on my present and my thinking is it affects what will come to mind automatically. The past, maybe even in some sense, determines what comes to mind automatically. But if I can get more than that volitionally, then the knowledge that I activate in that way can override the bad stuff I had that I put in earlier, I think. So I guess I probably don't agree with the idea, but we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. I don't think I agree with the idea that you have to give all that stuff a hearing. I don't think I agree with that. But I admit that I'm not 100% sure here. I'm just going by my own experience, which is I don't generally mess around with doing a lot of ruminating about the past when I'm thinking about stuff. I try to discover what's true. I try to activate the knowledge I need to discover what's true. But the past does affect you. It affects you by determining what comes to mind automatically. That's where the past comes in. And that's where I think I can just essentially blow by that.
We've got a question here from Peter asking,
yes,
might learning to introspect while shooting baskets lead to becoming distracted while actually playing basketball?
Yeah, normally when you're playing, which I haven't been doing any basketball lately, because for one thing, it's a contact sport and you're not allowed to do that. But also I play a lot more table tennis. Like Peter, by the way, is a really good table tennis player. He used to be at least a really good table tennis player. He had some excellent spin. But in basketball, yes, you don't normally want to be thinking about what to think about next or any of that introspective stuff. You just mostly have to trust what's automatized. And when you're in the game, because if you're sitting there thinking about what to think about, where's the gap in my thinking, what am I missing here, what else do I need to know, and stuff like that, your opponent will grab the ball from you and steal the ball and go score a basket. So you just have to rely on what's automatized for the most part. But I do think introspection is a skill, and you can do some introspection even in the game. But you have to know yourself. You have to know how good an introspector you are in order to do that. But mostly, you want to do introspection in sports when you're practicing, not when you're playing, for the most part, for just that reason. You're up here, you have to rely on what's automatized. It's just pretty much the same thing as if you're out there. This is an example I use in my Maya and Monroe Trout's paper called "What Is Consciousness For?" I'll put my plug in. That any of you who wants to read about what is consciousness for can get a free copy of the paper at New Ideas in Psychology. Just put in "What is consciousness for?" Pierson and Trout, and you get a free paper about this. Anyway, I talk about the example of a lion comes at you, and you're out there on the plain, and the lion starts after you. You don't want to sit there and be thinking, either introspecting or even thinking about things like the fur, how thick is the lion's fur, and how long are his teeth, and how fast is he running. You just want to run. And I think that's why, I believe that's why certain emotions are so disturbing of thinking, cause so much disturbance of thinking. You might wonder, strong emotions interfere with thinking. Now, why is that? What good is that? How did that get built into human beings? It doesn't seem, if thinking is the thing, our means of survival, how is that the disturbance caused by fear and other strong emotions? How does that help your survival? It seemed it should have been wiped out, but it does, because it inhibits immediate thought when you should just react. Immediate thought and immediate introspection, which is a form of thought. It inhibits both of those things, so that you just run. And then when you get home, back to the fire with your fellow, I was going to say cave dwellers, but we're doing this on the African plains or something. You're back sitting around the fire. It will motivate thinking about what to do the next time. But you don't want to be doing your thinking when the danger's coming. So, yeah, in other words, I'm just agreeing with what Peter was saying. You don't want to, for the most part, you want to do your introspection not when you're performing the action for real, but in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Within the field of peak performance, they talk about you do all those skills during the deliberate practice, not in the actual game. And so I think that's what you were talking about, practice. And then, so we've got another question.
For the most part, I mean.
Yeah, for the most part. But
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But we've got a question here from Boris saying, isn't learning programmed into us, as that's our primary way of survival as humans?
Isn't learning programmed into us? Okay, that's an interesting question. I guess it is, but deterministic learning is not,
as that's
runs into all kinds of troubles.
Way of survival as human.
Just a second.
Okay. I don't know if I'd say our primary means of survival is reason, just like Ayn Rand says, and reason is a volitional faculty, because that reason gives you the flexibility to deal with new situations that just deterministic learning, whatever that would mean, would not be adequate for. I mean, it's true. Somebody just said little kids tend to learn fairly automatically. I mean, for example, language learning is pretty automatic, because we find out no matter what kind of kids you have, whether they're by nature curious, by nature active, and so on, they'll almost all learn language. Everybody learns language, so that happens. So there is a certain automatic base to learning, but I don't think that describes everything that we do to survive. I think the rational process is a volitional process, and you need to think. You need to use your volition to exert the mental effort to go beyond the automatic. That's what I was bringing up in some of these examples, is the point that, yeah, there are automatic processes, but they're not good enough. They don't always give you the answer. You limit yourself. You'll make all kinds of errors, and you'll get in trouble. Whereas if you have volition, you can go beyond that. You can activate more knowledge than comes to mind automatically, and that is very often necessary to reach the goal of your thinking. Is to act the automatic stuff. It's just an empirical fact that it doesn't work. It's not sufficient. That what comes to mind automatically is not sufficient. And sometimes it's counter to what you need, because you don't automatically look for the kinds of counter examples that you need in order to be objective, for example. So let me see, there was something else on this point that I had in my head, and it just flew out of the focus and into the fringe and out into space. What was it? I'll think of it in a minute. No, let's go ahead.
All right. Dr. Binswanger says, if learning were programmed, how would you explain the current state of the world? I would blame the programmer.
Oh, I see. If learning were really perfect, if it really worked for us perfectly, well, then we wouldn't make mistakes. We wouldn't be in this horrible mess. We wouldn't get any kind of horrible messes. But in fact, it is a simple empirical fact. People make mistakes, and the mistake, if it was all just by deterministic learning, we'd have to make those mistakes. So we don't have the ultimate program. I suppose if there were some ultimate program that could handle all the contingencies that could come up in the universe. If there were such a program, you'd probably have to have a gigantic head that you drag around with you to hold this program, or whatever. If there were such a program, then you wouldn't need free will. But in fact, it's not true. We make mistakes, and it's natural to make mistakes because we don't have the ultimate program. And to get past that, what we have instead is free will. Consciousness and free will gives us the flexibility to go beyond the limitations of a deterministic system. So yeah, I'm glad Harry chimed in. Just look around you and you can see that we are not determined to learn in the sense of learn everything we know in order to survive. People fail to learn that frequently.
Dr. Binswanger has a follow-up.
Yeah, I agree that one function of free will is to allow for objectivity and self-correction and elimination of errors. But it's not true, as I'm sure you would agree, that most people go around trying to reach conclusions about everything, only they get some wrong. Most people just don't try to learn. And the nearly automatic or maybe automatic learning that happens at 2 or 3 is not carried into adulthood. We don't find people doing all that activity to try to come up with answers on big questions.
True.
Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We don't. I think there's a reason for that, which is that why did biology not build into us automatic learning that goes many steps? And I think the answer is if a deterministic system tries to go many steps, it gets into trouble very quickly.
Yeah.
So we didn't have that built into us. We got free will, and there's a lot of people out there that are not exerting their free will. Yeah.
So we have a question from Josh, and then 3 hands raised. Hopefully we'll get to all of those. I don't think we'll get to any more after that. So Josh asks, why is the field of psychology so scared of introspection?
How much time do we have for this one? Okay. Why is it scared of introspection? Let me see. I think there are 3 big concepts that modern psychology either denies or ignores, at least for the most part: consciousness, volition, and introspection. They're all connected. And consciousness in psychology, it's behaviorism. The influence of behaviorism is still with us. The behaviorism, the idea that what you need, that you shouldn't. Consciousness is unscientific. Either some of them say it doesn't exist. Some of them will say, well, it exists, but it's not a subject for scientific study. There are variants of these things. But basically, they say, you want to be a scientist, go out and do what the physical scientists do. Look at observable behaviors, things you can perceive with your eyeballs, rats running mazes, pigeons pecking buttons, and stuff like that. So that was a strong, because psychologists are kind of envious of the physical sciences because they have not achieved as much. And so they would like to imitate rather than emulate the physical sciences. And that led to behaviorism, which came in the beginning of the 20th century and wiped out introspective psychology. And then cognitive psychology came in, what they call cognitive psychology. But cognitive psychology in academia, I'm not talking about the clinical stuff so much, but the more basic cognitive psychology was based on the idea that human beings might be like computers. See, it's almost worse than the behaviorists who thought human beings were like rats. At least rats are living entities. But modern cognitive psychology started with the idea, maybe we can talk about internal processing and cognition because that's what computers do. But then it's not what computers aren't conscious. They don't have consciousness. They don't have volition. And introspection is sort of irrelevant if you don't have consciousness. And that's still dominant. That view is still dominant in academic cognitive psychology. I'm not talking about cognitive behavior therapy. That's a different axis, really. It's got some relation, but I'm talking about the academic cognitive psychology. So it was behaviorism, I think, was the thing that really wiped out psychology for the whole 20th century. Just about ruined it, and it's still with us. And so consciousness being something considered to be mystical, not real, and so introspection can't be a real form of cognition because introspection is only about ghosts, such. So of course there have been research studies that try to show that introspection doesn't work. But what they do for the most part is show that you can fool people. People can be fooled about what's going on in their mind. And you know what? People can be fooled about what's going on in their minds about extrospective stuff too. There are all kinds of magic tricks can fool people. And that doesn't prove that perception or conceptual thinking is invalid. It doesn't prove that. And so the things that they've shown about introspection doesn't show that introspection is invalid either. And by the way, introspection is making a little bit of a comeback. Consciousness has become somewhat respectable. There is a field called consciousness studies, but I think most psychologists do not still kind of sniff at that. So there's a lot more to that, but that's at least a start on the answer. And by the way, it's really important, I think, that psychologists understand the importance of consciousness. I mean, it's the subject matter that gives rise to the field, and yet most psychologists don't really consider consciousness an important thing, or even a thing in some cases. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and we have a few hands raised. I know Josh has to leave.
Yep.
Lee, if you can stay a few minutes longer, we might be able to.
I'll be glad to stay around as long as anybody wants to, sure.
All right. So
I see your lights are going out, though.
Yeah, well, the lights in the office are still on. So.
Yeah, okay.
So
Go ahead.
So I've always thought introspection was important. So throughout my life, I'm trying to think whether I have the right idea of what introspection is. So kind of want to clarify it with you. Maybe you can give a quick definition of what introspection is and also a few examples. So today we talked mostly about sort of brain teaser problem solving sort of examples, which is maybe you could characterize as thinking about your thinking. And then we also sort of mentioned, introspecting on your, basketball playing. So there's introspection about your, automatized physical muscle memory sort of things. Do those two things exhaust the kind of categories of what introspection is, or are there other important examples that you can give so we can flesh out our idea of what introspection is? Okay,
that's good. No, I don't know if I can't remember now if I mentioned this, but there have been many lectures and many talks and a few articles and snippets here and there about introspection in objectivism. Almost all of that stuff is about introspection on emotions. And that I would say that's a perfectly legitimate topic. That's another category of things. You try to identify what your emotions are, and then go looking for what their causes are. Of course, you end up going back to your thinking. Introspection on emotion frequently ends up being introspection on thinking because it goes back to that. But that gives you another category of looking at emotions. Emotions are the form in consciousness in which you experience automatized value judgments, the way you experience them in consciousness, the form. So if you want another way of looking at introspection, I don't know if I exactly put it this way, just I gave a couple of perspectives. One of them is, another perspective would be, introspection is an abstractive abstraction, I'll say an abstractive focus on the form over the object of consciousness. You know, attention more to the form, abstracting out the form of consciousness rather than the object, and that's an objectivist distinction. So you can think about the object out there in the world. If you're looking at some object like a car, when you're thinking about the car, that's extrospection. When you're thinking about the words in your mind, you're identifying the words in your mind or the feelings in your mind as you look at the car. That would be introspection. So that's one way of looking at it. I think I also said it was conceptual identification of what's going on in your mind. That would be a general description. The point I would make there, and this is not everybody would agree with me. Not everybody would agree with me on this. I don't think that the genus of introspection is perception. The genus of introspection is thinking. It's a form of thinking, primarily anyway. You don't have to perceive what you're already aware of. You're already aware of that. It's kind of redundant to talk about perceiving your own awareness, I think. That's what I believe. It's a conceptual identification. Now there is, in addition, there is what I referred to as introspection light. Monitoring, paying attention to inklings, you know, being ready to be aware of what's going of things on your mind, which is a little closer to being perceptual, but even that I wouldn't say is perception. So anyway, introspection is a form of thinking directed towards the form of consciousness rather than the object. How's that? Let's do it like that.
Our next question is from Joseph.
Yep. It was a little bit earlier. You talked about deleting knowledge. I remember Peikoff. He was having a talk about these kind of things, and I've experienced as well that if I rationally think through a subject, then I come often to a point where I have to suppress the idea that I used to have. So when that context comes up, I'm just like, you know, almost like I'm slamming my mind shut and just saying, I've been thinking this through. That is not a rational position to take, and I'm just going to cut that line of thought completely out. And my experience has been that it's getting weaker and weaker over time. I don't know if I ever get to the point where it's completely suppressed, but or if suppression is the right word to use. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. If I'm suppressing, or what am I doing?
Okay. All right. You bring up a thorny topic, sir. Okay. I never do that. I never suppress anything. I do not suppress. I am, my way of functioning, rightly or wrongly, is I am absolutely not afraid to think about anything whatsoever. My favorite line in world literature is, there are no evil thoughts except one, the refusal to think. That's Francisco D'Antoni, and that was shrugged.
It will get to the point where it's a waste of time.
Nevertheless, I don't suppress it. I may go on to do other things. See, I'm perfectly happy to go, but I don't suppress anything. I don't believe in that. And the reason I don't is it can be found in the very same lecture, because that comes from Dr. Peikoff's lectures on what do they call it? Thinking is in the title. Anyway, he points out that even with the best will in the world, you can still make mistakes. That being objective and being rational does not guarantee that you will arrive at the truth. So just because you've thought it through, and that's it. If you then use enact a policy of suppression, you will shortcut, or not shortcut. John Galt. It's not a shortcut. It's a short circuit. You will short circuit your self-correction. So I just absolutely never do that. But I don't have to. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time ruminating about, just like I'm sure you don't either, I don't spend a lot of time ruminating about my past thoughts. I just go on, but I would not suppress. I do not. I think suppression is immediately destructive of your self-correction. You have to be able to correct your errors. And if you suppressed it all the time, well, there'd be some errors that you would not be able to correct. So that's what I think. It's interesting is that those two things came up in the same lecture. Not in the same lecture, sorry. In the same series of lectures, those points. The point about suppression, and then but this other point about that you can't, no matter what you do, there's still the possibility of error, and you need to be open to correcting it.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Binswanger.
Yeah, I agree enthusiastically with Lee. Without commenting on the lecture, which I don't think I fully understood, just talking about the phenomenon from my own standpoint, as long as something is nagging at you, you need to pay attention to that, and you need to get to the point where you say, oh, well, that's either, that's right. I thought it was wrong, but it's right. Or, no, that doesn't make any sense. And if your subconscious then stops nagging at you and is resolved, say, oh, I see what's wrong with that. No, that doesn't make any sense. Ridiculous. I'm turning to this now, which is, Joe, you were talking about, not wasting time on that. If your subconscious is saying authentically, realistically, emotionally, real time, well, this is just stupid. I don't need to think any more about that. There are important things to think about. That's different. But if it's tugging at you, you should look at it.
All right. I also, it was recommended to me to ask you about Libet, but I don't know who or what that is. So I'm going to.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I don't, Libet, whatever. He was a neurophysiologist from San Francisco. Every 5 years in the New York Times, they repeat discussion of his research as disproving free will. And because he did this experiment, and I don't think we can go into the details of it, but it was a Eeg experiment, and they measured various things, including he told the subjects to move your finger when you feel like moving it. I don't know if it's the exact instruction, but he had electrodes on the finger, and it could measure when the impulses and when it was moved. And you move your finger when you feel like it, and you have a clock, a rotating clock face, and you're supposed to notice when you got the urge to move. It's a very tricky experiment, and there are all kinds of methodological questions. But let me just cut to the without going through the details, just cut to the chase. I think the most fundamental problem, there are a couple of big problems, but the most fundamental is that this is a study, this is research about free whim, not about free will. Because the choice to move your finger when you feel like it is not the exertion of mental effort. And the exertion of mental effort is the signature of free will. So unfortunately, he didn't understand what free will was. Benjamin Libet. He just didn't understand what it was. So his experiment. There are other problems with the experiment. There's been a large literature. It's been redone many times in different ways and on both sides of the brain and with different ways of measuring the brain activity and stuff. But I think that's the most fundamental problem, is that it's not really about free will. The free will in the experiment comes much earlier when he's explaining to the subject what you're supposed to do, and they will choose to think about that or not. And then that thinking they do has some consequences for the movement of your finger. But when especially when he says move your finger when you feel like it, not when you think you should or something, when you feel. So it's just not a really experiment on free will. There's something else about Libet. Libet himself, by the way, believed in. Well, he didn't believe in free will. He believed in free won't. He believed that you could veto what your brain automatically told you could veto it. But I don't think that theory is right either. And he really just didn't understand. And it's not a refutation of free will. And I think over the years, it's become more clear even to academia that the experiments don't actually show what the New York Times says it shows. And you can't, by the way, you can't experimentally disprove free will. How could you do that? You need the whole notion of an experiment presupposes the existence of free will for you to be able to control the conditions involved. So you can't. Maybe that's too arcane a philosophical point. But you right away, if somebody says that their experiment disproves free will, I think you could be pretty confident that it's not true, and then you can look at it more as the way I did if you want to look at it more detail.
So Josh, before he left, texted me a question, which I think is a good way to wrap up. What would be some basic introspection skills for someone to practice as a start?
To practice as a start, well, first of all, I got to think about how old are you? Are we talking about adults? Are we talking about children? Harry's got a bunch of answers for this for children, I think. I don't. He might want to. Is he still around? He had a number of answers for children about free will and maybe introspection too. He had a number of things.
Yeah, I don't remember a lot of them now, but there were things like, do you hear words in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Do you ever think you don't think? Are there sometimes when you're not saying anything in your head to yourself? This is for very young children.
It would be bad for some older people to try a couple of those questions too, actually. Would not be a bad thing. So you can start with that. What else can you do? I mean, this comes up in the context of doing performing other skills. So I would do a lot of introspective training when teaching people, and I have done this, teaching people how to read with good comprehension, because I tell them that you ought to alternate reading the text and reading your own mind. Go back and forth. Read some text, and then think about, have I really understood this? Have I got all this right? Am I missing anything here? Can I say what, in a nutshell? Can I give the gist of what I just read? Those kinds of questions. You alternate. So you develop the skill of introspection along with developing other skills. And reading is a good one, because people are I think, often they don't do near enough introspection. They just read stuff. They'll read a passage and they either get it or they don't. They come to the end of the passage, they got something, they didn't get something, they don't know what they got, they don't know how much they got. Whereas if they read introspectively, if they read and alternate, if they don't get something, they will shrink down the size of the unit that they look at. So if they don't understand a paragraph, they'll look at a few sentences. If they don't understand a few sentences, they'll go down to the one sentence, try to get to the nub of it. If they don't understand, if the sentence is no good, they might get down to what is a widow, perhaps. So that kind of alternation is a very important skill. So you develop it along with other skills, along with problem-solving skills, reading skills, analyzing arguments. That's a good kind of skill to develop your introspection on thinking technique. That's how you do it. You don't do it in isolation, because there is no isolation. Extrospection and introspection necessarily go together. You can't separate. You can abstract, but you can't separate them. And abstraction is, somebody taught me this, I think his name was Harry Bidswanger, that abstraction is not the denial of other stuff, the stuff that you abstract away from. It's not ignoring the other stuff. That's not what it is. So anyway, I think you develop a skill in conjunction with other cognitive skills. Reading comes to mind immediately as a good one.
All right. So Lee, I want to thank you again for this talk, and I want to thank everybody.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, and I'll thank Josh as well, even though he's not here, and everybody who attended.
Oh yeah, thanks, Josh.
We have up to 3 of these events every week, as I mentioned, and a daily show, 20-minute show on Facebook Live. I encourage everybody to watch all that and participate in future events. All our stuff is on YouTube as well, so you can and should go there and check it out. And if you like our content and like our events, I encourage you to consider joining our membership program. Posted the link in the chat. If you're, by the way, if you're on the highest level, I know a bunch of people here heard about this event on HBL. If you're on the highest level of membership, your HBL subscription is included in that, as is your Objective Standard print and digital subscription, discounts on Ocon, a bunch of other stuff, and you help us do more of this, and hopefully soon live events as well in person in London, which will also go on YouTube. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope to see you at our next event.